Cameron Lowe picks out books that can help us focus our attention and glimpse the sublime, including a quarantine reading list from Zadie Smith. There are many skeletons in our literary closets. Novels like Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace or Herman Melville's Moby Dick often put people off because of their length, and many linger on our reading list for years or decades. Others, like Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time or James Joyce's Ulysses, have become a byword for daunting, modernist, experimental writing that is unintelligible without resorting to scholarly notes, pushing the novel form to its limit. Especially these days, who is going to question your desire to sit and binge on crime thrillers if that's what you want? And yet, what if we treat the current crisis as an opportunity to put aside our aversion to the challenging read? Is now the time for us to pay some attention to other things, including attention itself? In her 2014 book Department of Speculation, Jenny O'Feill recounts an anecdote. The Zen master Ikkyu was once asked to write a distillation of the highest wisdom. He wrote only one word: attention. The visitor was displeased. Is that all? So Ikkyu obliged him. Two words now: attention, attention. O'Feill writes magnificent, terse, oracular books which enact the idea that words can be opened up by paying close heed to things. I propose that we consider the possibility of recalibrating our minds and focusing on demanding writers. Two key thinkers on this subject are Jenny Odell, whose revolutionary book How to Do Nothing encourages us to wake up to and resist all the petty 21st century demands on our attention, and Zadie Smith, who is a wonderful novelist but also a passionate and intelligent critic. She has even managed to write a collection of essays during lockdown, due to be published on the 28th of July. Odell encourages us to make space in which to think. Smith encourages us to use it. Odell urges us to approach with strong skepticism the attention economy that is manifested in our smartphones and is designed to attack the very ideas of contemplation and of personal space. Smith is an indefatigable contemplator. Her range of reference is huge, and she inspires me to broaden my own. For example, she turned my view of the famously daunting writer David Foster Wallace on its head not long after the US author committed suicide in 2008. Smith wrote The Difficult Gifts of David Foster Wallace, which is in her collection Changing My Mind. It helps us to reassess DFW, often regarded as an obscure, uncompromising, avant-garde geek who wrote impenetrable tracts. Smith says to appreciate Wallace, you need to really read him, and then you need to reread him. For this reason, among many others, he was my favorite living writer. Smith is captivated by the short stories in DFW's Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, 1999. I never got DFW until I started reading The Pale King, 2011, the book he was working on when he died, and which was published posthumously. Then I had an epiphany. This is a book about the heroism of late capitalist boredom and exquisite appreciation of dullness. It is set in and steeped in the culture of an internal revenue service center. The structure of the book is polyphonic and fragmentary. I suggest you try chapter 19, in which people trapped on an elevator have a civics discussion. or the formerly mind-blowing chapter 25, in which nothing happens but the turning of pages, and yet there are ghosts and everything happens. At this moment, I can't think of a better example than The Pale King of what the contemporary novel can do when it throws caution to the wind. Smith's 2008 essay, Two Paths for the Novel, reproduced in her collection of essays Changing My Mind, dented my view of realism in fiction. In it, Smith suggested that a certain predictable lyrical realism had become the acceptable face of contemporary fiction. She takes Joseph O'Neill's Netherlands 2008 as an example. At the expense of a more stringent metafictional tradition, for example, Virginia Woolf, Joyce, and Samuel Beckett, which poses difficult questions about reality and human psychology and the ability of words to describe them. She uses Tom McCarthy's Remainder 2005 as an example. Smith says that lyrical realist novels offer the nostalgic pleasure of returning to a narrative time when symbols and mottos were full of meaning and novels weren't neurotic but could aim themselves simply and purely at transcendent feeling. In other words, the author projects themselves poetically, the more poetically the better, onto their subject and mistakes the procedure for meaning. In O'Neill's book, which is set in post 9/11 New York, the destruction of the Twin Towers portends the collapse of a marriage, among other things. Books like these don't always require our full attention. Of course, there is also much to be said for permitting your mind to surf on a book, as there is for letting your mind move over any art form and pick up sparks from it. Rethinking reality. The approach of a McCarthy novel, in contrast, is more dicey. A writer and artist steeped in 20th century French thought, he issues ironic artistic edicts such as calling for all cults of authenticity to be abandoned. Don't worry, McCarthy has a sense of humor. Book reviews have called him a latter-day Franz Kafka and a new Thomas Pynchon. I always think, okay, but what was wrong with the old ones? In Two Paths, Smith says that McCarthy's project is to rid the self of its sacredness, a campaign that so far extends over 4 novels. She calls Remainder one of the great English novels of the past 10 years. It is written with a sparse elegance that makes few traditional concessions to the reader. The book's main character, who isn't named, suffers a blow to the head in an unspecified accident, and after seeing a crack in the plaster of a bathroom wall, begins to obsess about whether reality is real. He uses his large insurance settlement in increasingly elaborate attempts to stage an authentic reality. We never have a sense of who he is because he doesn't know who he is and never finds out. In a 2014 article called Writing Machines on Realism and the Real, McCarthy protests that time and again we hear about a new desire for the real, about realism which is realistic set against an avant-garde which isn't. He goes on to argue that a writer, artist, etc., can never know the real, that what they imagine to be real is always inauthentic, and that the real can only assert itself as rupture of our expectations. It is in the nature of art to crack and fragment. Acknowledging the unreliability of our perception might be a good thing. Both Smith and McCarthy are drawn to J. G. Ballard's novel Crash, 1973, an intriguingly warped book about the intersection of sex, death, technology, psychology, and loss of meaning. that provoked the establishment of the Time to froth at the mouth about pornography. It is now seen as a classic. In her introduction to the 2009 reissue, Smith talks about how radically the book reverses the relationship between man and technology. Instead of the former using the latter uses and defines and empties the former. For all that, Crash is an oddly human book. It is definitely not comfort reading. And its characters are a puzzle. We can't even entirely know them. This is a characteristic of what are loosely called the postmodern novelists, in the sense that postmodern means being self-conscious about the business of being an author. Some people find this lack of narrative bearings frustrating, but I find it inspiring. I'm happy to get lost in these books and work for my glimpses of the sublime. If you're patient, they'll always deliver. Vladimir Nabokov is one of the fathers of playful, human metafiction. Everyone talks about Lolita, but in many ways he is at his best in Pnin, which Smith also cites as one of her favorite books. The gradual sketching in of the main character, Timothy Pnin, is a confusing delight. Harold Bloom, one of the greatest of literary critics, who died last year, talks about a canon of the American sublime that encompasses the great postmodern writers Cormac McCarthy, Don DeLillo, Thomas Pynchon, Philip Roth. Bloom especially settles on Pynchon, grandmaster of the glorious writerly tailspin, the first author sleepy readers say they want to avoid. There will be no surfing on Pynchon. Either you control your breathing and give his sentences your full attention, or you put the book down, pick up some genre fiction, my poison is epic fantasy at the moment, and come back to him another day. Bloom loved all of Pynchon, but he singled out the novella The Crying of Lot 49 as an important artifact, and that may be the best place to start. Of course, there are those who disagree. In a now famous essay, the high profile critic James Wood sets out to damn the likes of Pynchon, DeLillo, DFW, and Salman Rushdie. He implies these writers, with their vertiginous lack of artistic boundaries, are dysfunctional and need to seek treatment. This move, I'm not crazy, you're the one who's crazy. He says, an excess of storytelling has become the contemporary way of shrouding in majesty a lack. It is the Sun King principle that lack is the human. A second version of Wood's essay, published in The Guardian, blames DeLillo for everything. Lately, any young American writer of any ambition has been imitating DeLillo. His technical virtuosity in extremis, his fiddling while Rome burns. The Rome in question is the US after 9/11. Yet no writer has anatomized the US since World War II more convincingly and devastatingly than DeLillo. Its paranoia, violence, egotism, consumerism. One way into DeLillo's work is via his 1997 magnum opus, Underworld. Parts of it previously appeared as short stories. Instead of trying to swallow the whole thing like a snake eating a buffalo, it is possible to sample the book instead. The prologue about baseball is one of the great bravura performances of modern prose. But part one, Long Tall Sally, is more accessible and more likely to pull you in. The sustained pitch of his imagination, of poetry, throughout the book is just astonishing.